Elena Vasquez pressed her back against the service elevator's cold metal wall, clutching the orientation folder that promised a new beginning. The elevator climbed silently toward the penthouse level of the Sterling estate, each floor marker lighting up like a countdown to her salvation, 3 months behind on rent. Sophia's school shoes held together with duct tape. The eviction notice still crumpled in her purse like a paper knife, cutting deeper every time she remembered its existence. The elevator doors whispered open to reveal a hallway that belonged in a medical journal rather than a home. White marble floors reflected harsh LED strips embedded in the ceiling, creating an antiseptic brightness that made Elena squint. The air carried the faint scent of eucalyptus oil, but underneath it lurked something chemical and cold that reminded her too much of the pediatric ICU where she used to work, before she lost everything. "You must be Elena." The voice cut through the sterile silence with surgical precision. Dr. Victoria Sterling emerged from a doorway at the end of the hall, her heels clicking against marble with metronomic authority. Everything about her screamed expensive control. The perfectly styled blonde hair that cost more than Elena's monthly grocery budget. The cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Elena's car. The smile that never quite reached her pale blue eyes. "Dr. Sterling, thank you for this opportunity." Elena's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory. She extended her hand, noting how Victoria's grip lingered just long enough to establish dominance. "Please, call me Victoria. We're going to be working very closely together." Victoria's gaze swept over Eleanor's thrift store interview outfit with clinical assessment. "I trust you reviewed the confidentiality agreement. The Sterling family values privacy above all else." Elena nodded, remembering the document's unusual thickness. 37 pages of legal language that essentially boiled down to see nothing, hear nothing, speak nothing. The compensation had been too generous to question, too desperately needed to refuse. "Good. Let me show you your domain." Victoria led her through a series of interconnected rooms that felt more like a luxury medical facility than a family home. Everything was white, or glass, or chrome. Surfaces so pristine they seemed to repel human touch. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Arizona desert, but the glass was tinted to filter out warmth, leaving the landscape looking cold and alien. They passed a kitchen where a uniformed cook worked in absolute silence, preparing what looked like specialized meals on digital scales. The living area contained furniture that appeared designed for display rather than comfort, all sharp angles and surfaces that would show every fingerprint. Family photographs lined one wall, but they felt staged, professional, like marketing materials for the concept of happiness rather than genuine moments of joy. The family consists of myself, my husband Dr. James Sterling, and our son Marcus. Victoria's tone carried the same clinical detachment she might use to describe a research project. Marcus is 6 years old and requires specialized care due to his condition. He has a rare genetic disorder that affects his immune system, very delicate constitution. Elena nodded, her nursing instincts automatically cataloguing the information. "What specific care requirements does he have? That's precisely why we need someone with your background." Victoria stopped before a heavy oak door marked with a small brass nameplate, "Marcus. Your medical training will be invaluable in monitoring his condition. However, I must stress that his treatment protocol is unconventional, cutting-edge research that hasn't yet received FDA approval." Red flags began unfurling in Elena's mind like warning banners. Experimental treatments. Unapproved protocols. The same language that had cost her career when she'd questioned similar irregularities at Phoenix Children's Hospital. But Sophia's face appeared in her memory, thin and tired from too many dinners of rice and beans, and Elena forced the concerns down. "I understand," she said, though she understood too much. Victoria opened the door to reveal a bedroom that looked like a high-end hospital room disguised as a child's space. Medical monitors sat beside toy shelves. An IV stand was draped with superhero decorations. The bed was a hospital bed with rails, but covered in cartoon character sheets. In the center of it all sat a pale, thin boy who looked far younger than 6, his dark eyes too large for his hollow face. "Hello, Marcus." Elena approached the bed with the careful gentleness that had once made her the favorite nurse on the pediatric ward. "I'm Elena. I'm going to be taking care of you." Marcus studied her with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for his age, as if he were measuring her for some purpose she couldn't understand. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to help the baby too?" Victoria's hand landed on Elena's shoulder with sudden firmness. Marcus sometimes gets confused about his medications, causes hallucinations, poor thing. But her grip tightened like a warning. "There is no baby, Elena. Marcus is our only child." The boy's eyes flickered between his mother and Eleanor, and in that glance, Eleanor saw something that chilled her. Fear. Not the fear of illness or pain, but the fear of speaking truth in the presence of power. "Of course," Eleanor said softly, keeping her voice neutral. But she filed the moment away, in the part of her mind that had learned to document inconsistencies. Victoria led her through the rest of the tour with increased efficiency, pointing out security cameras in every corner, motion sensors on every door, and a sophisticated alarm system that would track her movements throughout the house. "For safety," Victoria explained, but Elena heard the subtext, "for surveillance." They ended in what Victoria called Elena's command center, a small office adjacent to Marcus's room, equipped with medical monitoring equipment and communication devices. "You'll spend most of your time here during your shifts. Marcus requires constant supervision, but I trust you'll find ways to occupy yourself during quiet periods." A thick binder sat on the desk labeled Care Protocols, Confidential. Eleanor flipped through it briefly, noting the complex medication schedules, dietary restrictions, and behavioral monitoring requirements. Everything was documented with obsessive detail, as if Marcus were a research subject rather than a child. "One final thing," Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are certain areas of the house that are off-limits to all staff. The basement levels contain my research laboratory, and access is strictly forbidden. The security system will alert us immediately if anyone attempts entry without authorization." Elena nodded, but her mind was already working. In her experience, forbidden areas existed for one of 2 reasons: to protect something valuable or to hide something terrible. Given the clinical atmosphere of this supposed family home, she suspected it was the latter. "Any questions?" Victoria's smile had returned, but it felt like a blade wrapped in silk. "Just one. The medication schedule shows some drugs I'm not familiar with. Will I receive training on their effects and potential complications?" Victoria's smile froze for just a moment, a micro-expression of annoyance before the mask slipped back into place. "All medications have been approved by Marcus's specialists. Your job is to administer them according to schedule, not to question their efficacy. I trust that won't be a problem." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Elena recognized the tone from her final confrontation with the hospital administration, the sound of authority preparing to crush dissent. She'd learned too late that some battles couldn't be won through direct confrontation. "Of course not," Elena replied, but something in her chest hardened like a stone. She would follow orders, document everything, and wait for the moment when compliance became the weapon that brought down the kingdom built on secrets. As Victoria led her back toward the elevator, Elena caught a glimpse of something that stopped her breath. Through a gap in a partially closed door, she saw stairs leading downward into blue-white light and heard the distant hum of machinery that sounded exactly like the life support systems she'd worked with for years. The basement was more than a research laboratory. It was a medical facility. And despite Victoria's insistence that Marcus was their only child, Elena's trained ear detected something else in that mechanical symphony. the steady rhythm of infant life support. Somewhere in this pristine prison, a baby was fighting for its life. Elena stepped into the elevator, her face carefully neutral, but her mind was already at work. She would take care of Marcus, follow every protocol, and document every irregularity. She would be the perfect employee right up until the moment she had enough evidence to bring this entire house of lies crashing down. Some rules, after all, were made to be broken, especially when they were designed to protect monsters. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, carrying Elena down toward ground level and back toward her old life. But she was already planning her return, and next time she would be ready to find the truth hidden in the forbidden places of the Sterling Empire. 3 weeks into her employment at the Sterling estate, Elena had developed the predatory patience of someone who had learned to hunt in silence. She moved through the sterile corridors with the practiced efficiency of a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the marble floors, her presence barely registering on the elaborate security system that tracked every breath in the house. The routine had become as mechanical as the medical equipment that hummed throughout the mansion. 6 a.m. arrival through the service entrance. Marcus's morning medications, a cocktail of immunosuppressants and experimental compounds that made Elena's nursing instincts scream warnings. Breakfast preparation, according to strict nutritional guidelines that read more like a laboratory protocol than a meal plan. Then hours of monitoring, documenting, and pretending not to notice the inconsistencies that multiplied like cancer cells through every aspect of the Sterling family's carefully constructed facade. Marcus Sterling was not dying. Elena had confirmed this with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years watching children fight for their lives. His color was good, his reflexes sharp, his energy levels those of a healthy 6-year-old, being systematically weakened by medications designed to suppress rather than heal. The rare genetic disorder existed only in the falsified medical files that Victoria updated weekly, creating a paper trail of progressive illness that bore no resemblance to the child Elena observed daily. But Marcus wasn't the real secret. He was camouflage, a distraction from something far more sinister, hidden in the basement levels that Victoria guarded like a military installation. Elena had spent 19 days mapping the house's security system, timing the guard rotations, and cataloguing the blind spots in surveillance coverage. The basement access was protected by biometric scanners, but the air circulation system told a different story. The building's HVAC network carried sounds, scents, and the electromagnetic signatures of medical equipment that Elena's trained senses could read like a medical chart. Somewhere below her feet, life support systems maintained something that required the same level of care as a premature infant. The rhythm patterns were unmistakable: ventilator cycles, cardiac monitors, feeding pumps, and twice, during the deepest night shifts when the house fell into its artificial slumber, Elena had heard something that made her blood freeze. The cry of a baby, muffled by distance and concrete but unmistakably human. Or mostly human. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Victoria made her first tactical error. Dr. James Sterling, the phantom husband who supposedly shared responsibility for Marcus's care, had been traveling on research business for the entire 3 weeks of Elena's employment. But Victoria's phone calls painted a different picture, fragments of conversation that Elena collected like evidence at a crime scene. The tissue compatibility is improving with each iteration. Yes, we can accelerate the timeline. Marcus is responding well to the preparation protocol. No complications with the surrogate incubation system. Surrogate. Not mother. Not family. Surrogate. Eleanor stood in the doorway of Marcus's room, watching him sleep with the peaceful innocence of a child who had no idea he was both victim and unwitting accomplice in his mother's monstrous plans. The medication schedule made perfect sense now, not treatment for illness, but preparation for surgery. His immune system was being suppressed not to save his life, but to prepare his body to accept foreign organs without rejection. The baby in the basement wasn't a patient, it was a donor. That afternoon, while Victoria attended what she called a research symposium, Elena made her move. The security system had a 15-minute window during shift change when the cameras cycled through their maintenance routine. She had memorized the pattern over weeks of careful observation, timing her movements to coincide with the brief gaps in surveillance coverage. The basement access was hidden behind a panel in Victoria's home office, disguised as part of the wall-mounted art installation. Elena's fingers found the concealed biometric scanner, but she had prepared for this obstacle. Victoria's coffee cup, saved from that morning's meeting, still held enough DNA residue on the rim to fool the primitive fingerprint reader. The scanner chirped its acceptance, and the panel slid away to reveal stairs descending into harsh blue-white light. Elena descended into hell, disguised as heaven. The basement laboratory was a masterpiece of medical technology and moral bankruptcy. Clean rooms with positive pressure systems housed equipment worth millions of dollars. Genetic sequencers hummed alongside cell cultivation chambers. Surgical suites maintained operating room sterility levels, and in the center of it all, a nursery that made Elena's heart stop beating. The infant in the transparent isolation chamber was perhaps 6 months old, connected to a web of life support systems that monitored every biological function. But this was no ordinary child. Elena's trained eye caught the subtle wrongness immediately. The slightly elongated limbs, the oversized cranium, the skin with an almost translucent quality that revealed the vascular network beneath. Genetic modifications that pushed the boundaries of human biology while maintaining just enough humanity to sustain life. Subject 7, according to the chart clipped to the incubation chamber, not a name, not a child, a product in development. Elena photographed everything with the micro camera Miguel had given her, documentation that would serve as evidence in the trials to come. But it was the genetic analysis reports that made her hands shake as she read them. The infant's DNA profile showed markers from multiple sources, a patchwork of genetic material harvested from children who had died under suspicious circumstances at hospitals where Victoria Sterling had served as consulting physician. And there, buried in the technical data, Elena found the confirmation that made everything personal. Genetic markers matching her nephew David, who had died 3 years ago during what the hospital had called routine surgery complications. Victoria Sterling hadn't just stolen organs. She had stolen the very essence of dead children, using their genetic blueprints to create custom-designed donors for her wealthy clients. David's DNA lived on in this basement prison, part of a hybrid creature designed to provide organs for children whose parents could afford to buy their way out of mortality. Elena's finger traced the genetic compatibility charts that covered one entire wall. Marcus Sterling's profile sat at the top, with projected organ harvest dates calculated down to the specific hour when his body would be ready to accept each transplanted organ. Heart, liver, kidneys, even neurological tissue. Every piece of Subject 7 had been designed to perfectly match her client. But Eleanor had uncovered Victoria's second lie in the process. Marcus wasn't sick, and he wasn't dying. He was being enhanced. The organ transplants weren't meant to save his life, but to improve it beyond normal human limitations. Enhanced cardiovascular capacity, increased liver function, modified neurological architecture. Victoria was attempting to create a genetically superior child using the harvested organs of her laboratory-grown hybrid. The evidence was overwhelming, documented in Victoria's own meticulous research notes. Federal crimes stacked on top of state crimes, stacked on top of violations of international law. Human trafficking, genetic experimentation, medical fraud, kidnapping, and a dozen other charges that would put Victoria Sterling away for multiple lifetimes. But Elena needed more than evidence. She needed a way to ensure that both Marcus and Subject 7 survived the exposure of their mother's crimes. And she needed an insurance policy to protect Sophia from the retribution that would surely follow. Her phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. DNA analysis complete. Your nephew's genetic profile matches multiple missing children cases across 3 states. We have them, Elena. Whatever you're going to do it now. Elena looked down at Subject 7, the hybrid child whose existence proved Victoria Sterling's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The infant's eyes were open, staring up at her with an intelligence that seemed far too advanced for its apparent age, as if it understood that its life hung in the balance of decisions being made by adults who saw it as either property or evidence. "I'm going to get you out of here," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a promise that would either save them both or destroy everything she had left to lose. She had spent 3 weeks documenting Victoria's crimes, building an airtight case that would bring justice for David and all the other children whose lives had been stolen to feed this genetic nightmare. But justice required witnesses, and witnesses required protection. Elena activated the emergency recording system on her phone and began documenting everything: the equipment, the genetic charts, the infant's condition, and her own testimony about what she had discovered. This recording would be uploaded to Miguel's secure servers, copied to federal authorities, and distributed to news outlets simultaneously. Even if Victoria Sterling managed to silence Elena permanently, the evidence would survive. But first, she had one more task to complete. Elena opened the sealed cabinet marked Emergency Protocols and found what she had suspected would be there: termination procedures for both Marcus and Subject 7, designed to eliminate evidence in the event of discovery. Victoria Sterling had planned for the possibility of exposure, but she had underestimated the determination of a mother protecting children, all children, including the ones created in laboratories and marked for harvest. Elena photographed the termination protocols, adding them to the growing collection of evidence that would ensure Victoria's conviction. But more importantly, she modified the electronic locks on the isolation chamber, programming them with override codes that would allow emergency responders immediate access to Subject 7 when the time came. As she prepared to leave the basement laboratory, Elena took one last look at the hybrid infant who carried her nephew's genetic legacy in its artificially enhanced DNA. Subject 7 had been created as a source of organs for Victoria's sick fantasies of genetic superiority, but Elena would ensure it lived to become something far more powerful: the living proof of Victoria Sterling's monstrous crimes. The trap was set, the evidence secured, and the timeline accelerated. Tomorrow, Victoria Sterling would learn that some rules couldn't be broken without consequences, and some people couldn't be silenced without fighting back. Elena climbed the stairs back toward the sterile perfection of the main house, carrying with her the weight of secrets that would shatter the Sterling empire like glass. Behind her, in the blue-white glow of the laboratory, Subject 7 continued its silent vigil, unaware that its existence had just become the key to its creator's destruction. What detail from this investigation shocked you the most? The genetic harvesting from dead children, or the discovery that Marcus isn't actually sick? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story is just getting started, and Elena's next move will change everything. The Phoenix Children's Hospital Charity Gala was Victoria Sterling's stage, and she performed on it like a virtuoso of benevolence. The ballroom of the Scottsdale Resort sparkled with the calculated glamour of Arizona's medical elite. 200 guests who had paid $5,000 per plate to celebrate the Sterling Foundation's groundbreaking research into pediatric genetic disorders. Elena stood in the shadows near the service entrance, wearing the black uniform of catering staff that rendered her invisible to the assembled crowd of surgeons, pharmaceutical executives, and politicians. Miguel had arranged her placement through a contact at the catering company, providing her with perfect access to document Victoria's public performance, while the evidence of her private crimes burned like a brand in Elena's memory. On stage, Victoria commanded attention with the effortless authority of someone who had never questioned her right to shape the world according to her vision. Her speech wove together statistics about childhood mortality with emotional appeals for funding, painting herself as a crusader against genetic disease, while omitting any mention of the hybrid infant breathing through artificial lungs in her basement laboratory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice carried across the silent ballroom with practiced emotion. "When we lose a child to genetic disease, we don't just lose that precious life. We lose all the potential they represented, the discoveries they might have made, the lives they might have touched, the children they might have raised." Her pause was perfectly timed for maximum impact. "But what if we could prevent those losses? What if we could give parents the power to ensure their children not only survive, but thrive beyond the limitations of natural genetics?" Polite applause rippled through the audience, but Elena heard something else in Victoria's words, a confession disguised as philanthropy. The woman was literally describing her illegal enhancement project as if it were legitimate research, confident that her audience lacked the context to understand what they were actually funding. Elena activated the recording device hidden in her uniform pocket, documenting Victoria's speech for the federal prosecutors who would soon have jurisdiction over the Sterling case. Every word was evidence, every gesture proof of the arrogance that had made Victoria careless enough to expose her crimes to public scrutiny. "The Sterling Foundation has made remarkable progress in genetic intervention technologies," Victoria continued, her smile bright enough to hide the shadow of Subject 7's artificial existence. "Our preliminary research suggests we can not only cure genetic defects, but optimize human genetics to eliminate hereditary diseases entirely. Imagine a world where no parent ever has to watch their child suffer from genetic disorders." Dr. Richard Hoffman, chief of pediatric surgery at Phoenix Children's Hospital, stood to ask the question Elena had been hoping someone would raise. "Dr. Sterling, your research sounds promising, but have these interventions been approved for human trials? The FDA has very strict protocols for genetic modification research involving minors." Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression of irritation before the mask of professional confidence slipped back into place. "Our research is conducted within all appropriate legal frameworks, Dr. Hoffman. We work closely with international oversight committees to ensure our protocols meet the highest ethical standards." Elena felt her phone vibrate with an incoming text from Miguel. "Legal just confirmed. No international approvals on file. She's lying in real time. Are you recording this?" Elena typed back, every word almost ready for phase 2. The evening progressed with the mechanical precision of high society theatre. Victoria worked the room with surgical efficiency, collecting pledges and promises, while Elena documented her interactions with specific targets. Hospital administrators who had approved suspicious research grants, pharmaceutical executives who had provided experimental compounds, and government officials who had overlooked regulatory violations in exchange for campaign contributions. The guest list read like a directory of medical corruption, and Victoria Sterling sat at the center of the web like a spider collecting flies. Elena's opportunity came during the silent auction when Victoria stepped away from the crowd to take a private phone call near the resort's outdoor terrace. Elena followed at a distance, positioning herself behind a decorative pillar where she could hear every word while remaining invisible to security cameras. "The timeline is accelerating," Victoria spoke in urgent whispers to whoever was on the other end of the call. "The organ compatibility is perfect, and Marcus is responding well to the preparation protocol. We can proceed with harvest next Tuesday." Elena's blood turned to ice. Tuesday was 4 days away. Subject 7 had 4 days to live unless Elena acted immediately. Yes, I understand the risks, Victoria continued, but the genetic enhancement potential is too valuable to delay. Once the neural tissue integration is complete, Marcus will have cognitive capabilities 30% above baseline human intelligence. The liver modifications alone will extend his lifespan by decades. Elena fumbled for her phone, ensuring the recording captured every word of Victoria's confession. This wasn't just organ harvesting, it was human enhancement using illegally created genetic material. Federal prosecutors would have enough evidence for multiple life sentences. What about the surrogate tissue? No one suspects anything. The nanny is just a former nurse with financial problems, easily controlled and easily disposed of when necessary. The casual mention of Elena's planned elimination sent adrenaline surging through her system. Victoria wasn't just planning to harvest Subject 7's organs, she was planning to eliminate all witnesses to her crimes. Elena herself had become expendable the moment she accepted the job. Victoria ended the call and turned to rejoin the gala, but stopped when she saw Elena standing in the shadows near the terrace entrance. For a moment, both women froze in perfect silence, predator and prey recognizing each other across the space between them. Elena. Victoria's voice carried a dangerous edge that hadn't been present during her public performance. "What are you doing here? You should be at home with Marcus." Eleanor had prepared for this moment, rehearsing her response until it carried the perfect blend of innocence and confusion. "Dr. Sterling, I'm working for the catering company tonight. I need the extra income to cover my daughter's school expenses. I had no idea you would be here." Victoria studied Elena's face with the calculating intensity of someone who made her living reading biological systems for signs of deception. "How convenient. And how long have you been standing there?" "I just stepped outside for some air. The kitchen gets so hot during service." Elena's voice remained steady, but her hand moved instinctively toward the recording device in her pocket. "Is everything all right? You look upset." "I'm fine." Victoria's smile returned, but it was blade-thin and twice as dangerous. "Actually, this works out perfectly. I was going to call you later tonight. We need to discuss some changes to Marcus's treatment protocol. Can you come in early tomorrow morning? Say 5 a.m.? Eleanor recognized the trap immediately. Victoria planned to eliminate her before the organ harvest proceeded on Tuesday, but Eleanor had prepared for this possibility, and her response was ready. "Of course, Dr. Sterling. Whatever Marcus needs." "Good." Victoria moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And Eleanor? I trust you understand the importance of discretion regarding everything you see and hear at the estate. Some conversations are meant to remain private." The threat was clear, but Elena had moved beyond fear into the cold clarity of purpose. She had the evidence, she had the recording, and she had Miguel waiting for her signal to release everything to federal authorities simultaneously. "I understand completely," Eleanor replied, meeting Victoria's gaze with the steady calm of someone who held all the cards. "Some secrets are too dangerous to keep." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she tried to decode the subtext in Elena's response, but Elena had already turned to walk away, leaving the doctor standing alone on the terrace with the growing suspicion that her carefully constructed empire was beginning to crack. Elena made her way back through the ballroom, past the glittering crowd that continued to celebrate Victoria Sterling's public facade while remaining oblivious to the monster hidden beneath the philanthropic mask. She had 4 days to save Subject 7, protect Marcus from his mother's enhancement scheme, and ensure that her own daughter remained safe from retribution. But first, she had one more performance to complete. Eleanor approached the registration table where volunteers were collecting contact information for future Sterling Foundation events. "Excuse me," she said to the volunteer, "I'd like to make a donation to Dr. Sterling's research. Could you tell me more about the specific projects the Foundation supports?" The volunteer's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in the cause. "Oh, Dr. Sterling's work is absolutely revolutionary. She's developing ways to fix genetic problems before they can hurt children. Imagine being able to give every child perfect health from birth. Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the implications. That sounds wonderful. And these treatments are available now? Well, they're still in development, but Dr. Sterling says they'll be ready for human trials very soon. She's been working with volunteer families who have children with genetic disorders. Elena felt the final piece of evidence click into place. Victoria had been recruiting families with sick children, promising experimental treatments, while actually using their genetic material to create organ donors for paying clients. The charity gala wasn't just fundraising, it was customer acquisition for an illegal genetic enhancement service. "Thank you for the information," Elena said, palming the business card that would provide Miguel with additional investigation targets. Dr. Sterling's work sounds truly life-changing. As Eleanor walked toward the exit, she passed Victoria one final time. The doctor was back to working the room with practiced charm, but Elena caught the moment when Victoria's eyes found her across the crowd. The look that passed between them was electric with mutual recognition, the moment when both players acknowledged that the game had moved beyond subterfuge into open warfare. Elena smiled and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before disappearing through the service exit into the Arizona night. Behind her, Victoria Sterling continued her performance for an audience that had no idea they had just witnessed the last public appearance of a woman whose crimes would soon dominate headlines across the nation. The confrontation was complete, the lines drawn, and the countdown to Tuesday's planned harvest had begun. Elena had 72 hours to bring down an empire built on stolen genetics and murdered children. Time to call in the authorities. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice served. Have you ever witnessed someone in power thinking they were untouchable? Elena's about to prove them very wrong. Federal agent Sarah Chen had seen enough crime scenes to recognize the moment when a case shifted from investigation to warfare. The call had come in at 3:47 a.m. Emergency federal warrant request based on evidence of human trafficking, illegal genetic experimentation, and conspiracy to commit multiple homicides. The evidence package delivered by investigative journalist Miguel Santos contained enough documentation to justify a full FBI task force deployment with backup from the Department of Health and Human Services, the DEA, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona. Now at 7:15 a.m., Chen stood in the command vehicle parked 2 blocks from the Sterling estate, studying surveillance footage while coordinating the largest federal operation in Arizona since the takedown of the Sinaloa cartel's Phoenix distribution network. The Sterling compound presented unique challenges: sophisticated security systems, potential destruction of evidence, and the presence of at least 2 children whose lives hung in the balance of tactical decisions made in the next few hours. "Target is mobile," reported Agent Martinez from the aerial surveillance unit. "Dr. Victoria Sterling just left the compound in a black Tesla, heading east toward Scottsdale Road. 2 security personnel remain on site, plus our confidential informant." Elena Vasquez had volunteered to remain inside the Sterling estate during the operation, providing real-time intelligence about Marcus's location and Subject 7's condition. Chen had initially refused to allow a civilian to remain in such a dangerous position, but Elena's medical training and intimate knowledge of the compound's layout made her indispensable to ensuring the children's safety during the raid. Phoenix PD has units positioned to intercept Sterling if she attempts to flee, Chen reported to the task force commanders. DEA confirms the pharmaceutical evidence suggests Schedule I controlled substances manufactured without license. Health and Human Services has pediatric medical specialists standing by for immediate care of both minors. The evidence Elena had gathered over 4 weeks of undercover work read like a catalogue of federal crimes spanning multiple jurisdictions. The genetic harvesting operation had connections to suspicious deaths in hospitals across 3 states, with Dr. Sterling serving as consulting physician in each location where children had died under mysterious circumstances. The DNA analysis confirmed that genetic material from at least 12 deceased children had been incorporated into Subject 7's artificially enhanced biology. Chen's earpiece crackled with an update from the technical surveillance unit. "We have confirmation of life signs in the basement laboratory. Multiple subjects, including one infant on advanced life support. Electronic surveillance shows the target has been attempting to contact someone since 6 a.m. Calls are being intercepted and blocked by NSA cooperation. The Sterling compound security system, which Victoria had believed made her operation impenetrable, had actually made the federal investigation easier. Every electronic communication was logged, every access attempt recorded, every movement within the facility tracked by the very surveillance network designed to protect Victoria's secrets. "This is Chen," she spoke into her radio. "All units confirm ready status. Remember, we have children inside. Priority 1 is medical safety. Priority 2 is evidence preservation. Priority 3 is suspect apprehension. Medical teams are authorized to override any tactical consideration if either child's life is in immediate danger." At 7:32 a.m., Elena's voice came through the secure communication channel she'd been given. "Victoria just called the house. She's suspicious about something, demanding that the security team verify my location every 15 minutes. She's also ordering them to begin emergency protocol termination of Subject 7. We need to move now." Chen felt the familiar adrenaline surge that preceded high-stakes operations. "All units, we are green for immediate entry. Medical teams prepare for emergency intervention on infant subject. Elena, can you delay the termination protocol?" "Already done." Elena's voice carried the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment. "I've disabled the electronic locks on the laboratory and activated emergency life support backup systems, but the security team is heading toward the basement now." "Roger that. Phoenix PD, we need immediate intercept of Dr. Sterling. She cannot be allowed to return to the compound. All federal units, execute warrant now." The Sterling Estate's front gate disintegrated under the controlled explosion of the FBI breaching team, followed immediately by tactical vehicles carrying agents equipped for both standard law enforcement and specialized medical emergency response. The compound's defensive systems, designed to keep intruders out, became a liability as federal technicians overrode security protocols and gained control of the entire facility within minutes. Chen led the primary team through the main entrance, while secondary units secured the perimeter and prevented any destruction of evidence. The sterile perfection of the Sterling home felt like a medical facility under siege, all harsh lighting and clinical surfaces that offered no place to hide from the systematic federal sweep. "Security team in custody," reported Agent Rodriguez from the basement access point. "2 suspects, no resistance. They were in the process of accessing the laboratory when we intercepted them." Chen reached Marcus Sterling's bedroom to find Elena maintaining her cover as the concerned nanny, keeping the confused 6-year-old calm while federal agents secured the area around them. Marcus appeared healthy, despite the falsified medical records that documented his supposed genetic disease. But Chen noted the IV line and medication pumps that suggested ongoing chemical suppression of his immune system. "Marcus, these people are police officers," Elena explained to the frightened child, with the gentle authority of someone trained in pediatric care. "They're here to help make sure you stay safe and healthy." "Where's my mother?" Marcus's voice carried the hollow tone of a child who had learned not to ask questions that might have uncomfortable answers. Elena exchanged a glance with Chen before responding. "Your mother is talking to some doctors about your medicine. These officers are going to take you to a hospital where other doctors can make sure you're feeling better." Chen activated her radio. "Medical team to Marcus Sterling's location. Patient appears stable, but shows signs of systematic medication suppression. need immediate pediatric evaluation and possible detox protocol. The real discovery waited in the basement laboratory, where Chen descended to find a facility that belonged in a science fiction nightmare rather than a private home. The genetic sequencing equipment alone was worth millions of dollars, most of it acquired through fraudulent research grants and illegal pharmaceutical purchases. But the centerpiece of Victoria Sterling's empire was the isolation chamber containing Subject 7. Dr. Amanda Foster, the pediatric specialist accompanying the federal team, conducted her examination of the hybrid infant with the careful precision of someone documenting evidence while providing emergency care. "This is unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of pediatric medicine," she reported to Chen. "Genetic modifications that push the boundaries of human biology while maintaining viability. The life support requirements suggest this infant cannot survive outside controlled environment conditions." Chen photographed the genetic charts that lined the laboratory walls, while federal evidence technicians began the careful process of preserving documentation that would serve as prosecution evidence. The scope of Victoria Sterling's crimes expanded with each document they uncovered: federal fraud, human trafficking, unlawful genetic modification, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of international bioethics treaties. Agent Chen, called Agent Martinez from the communications center Victoria had established in the laboratory's control room. "We've intercepted phone records showing regular communication with customers in 7 countries. This wasn't just about enhancing Marcus Sterling. This was a commercial operation selling genetic modifications to wealthy clients worldwide. The evidence suggested that Subject 7 was merely the most recent product in a genetic enhancement service that had been operating for at least 3 years. Victoria had been creating custom-designed organ donors, using genetic material harvested from deceased children, then selling the enhanced organs to parents willing to pay millions to give their children superhuman capabilities. Chen's earpiece crackled with an urgent update from the intercept team. "Dr. Sterling has been detained at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport attempting to board a private jet to Switzerland. She was carrying encrypted drives and approximately $2 million in international currency. Suspect is in federal custody and being transported to Phoenix FBI field office." At 9:17 a.m., exactly 2 hours after the operation began, Chen stood in the Sterling compound's main living area, surveying the systematic dismantling of a criminal empire built on stolen genetics and murdered children. Marcus Sterling was en route to Phoenix Children's Hospital under pediatric medical supervision, where doctors would begin the process of weaning him off the immunosuppressive drugs that had been preparing his body for illegal organ transplants. Subject 7 remained in the basement laboratory under the care of federal medical specialists who were working to determine whether the hybrid infant could survive transfer to a properly equipped research hospital. The child's existence posed unprecedented legal and ethical questions about artificial genetic enhancement and the rights of laboratory-created beings. Elena Vasquez sat in the kitchen being debriefed by federal prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about her 4 weeks of undercover investigation. Her courage in documenting Victoria Sterling's crimes had saved 2 children's lives and exposed a genetic trafficking operation that spanned multiple continents. "The evidence you gathered is enough to put Sterling away for the rest of her life," Chen told Elena during a break in the debriefing. "Multiple federal agencies are going to want to interview you over the coming weeks, but you should know that your actions prevented at least 2 murders and possibly saved the lives of future victims we haven't even identified yet." Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on the monitor displaying Subject 7's vital signs from the basement laboratory. "What happens to the baby now? It's not fully human, but it's alive and aware. What kind of life can it have?" Chen had been wondering the same thing. The legal system had no precedent for dealing with artificially created hybrid beings, especially ones designed as organ donors for genetic enhancement procedures. Subject 7 represented both evidence of horrific crimes and a living being whose existence raised fundamental questions about the boundaries of human rights. "That's going to be decided by people much smarter than me," Chen admitted. "But I can tell you that baby is alive today because you refused to look the other way when you saw something wrong. Sometimes that's the only choice any of us can make." As federal evidence technicians continued their methodical documentation of Victoria Sterling's genetic crimes, Elena sat in the sterile kitchen of the Sterling estate and thought about her nephew David, whose DNA lived on in the hybrid infant breathing through artificial lungs in the basement below. Justice would come for Victoria Sterling through the federal courts, but the real victory was simpler. 2 children would live to see tomorrow because one woman had chosen to fight back against impossible odds. The arrival of authority had transformed the Sterling estate from a fortress of genetic crime into a federal crime scene, but the hardest battles were still to come. Victoria Sterling would use every legal resource at her disposal to escape consequences for her actions, and Subject 7's future remained uncertain. But Elena had learned something important during her weeks inside Victoria Sterling's empire. Sometimes the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to, when ordinary people had the courage to make it work. The federal courthouse in Phoenix had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the preliminary hearing for Dr. Victoria Sterling drew a media circus that transformed the normally quiet judicial building into a battleground of cameras, protesters, and legal teams representing interests that spanned 3 continents. Agent Chen watched from the gallery as prosecutors prepared to present evidence that would either make legal history or collapse under the weight of its own unprecedented nature. Victoria Sterling sat at the defense table with the composed arrogance of someone who had spent her career believing that intellectual superiority placed her above the reach of conventional law. Her legal team, funded by Sterling Biotech's considerable resources, had spent the past week filing motions to suppress evidence, claiming everything from illegal search and seizure to prosecutorial misconduct. They had managed to delay the hearing twice, but federal prosecutors had finally cornered them into facing the mountain of evidence Elena had gathered. U.S. Attorney Janet Morrison stood to address Judge Patricia Williams with the careful precision of someone who understood that this case would set precedents for genetic crime prosecution for decades to come. "Your Honor, the evidence we will present today documents a systematic pattern of human trafficking, genetic experimentation, and conspiracy to commit multiple homicides spanning 3 years and involving victims across multiple states." Defense attorney Marcus Kellerman, a white-collar criminal specialist whose fees matched his reputation for getting wealthy clients acquitted on technicalities, rose to object before Morrison could continue. "Your Honor, the prosecution's characterization prejudices these proceedings from the outset. Dr. Sterling is a respected geneticist whose research has been mischaracterized by a disgruntled former employee with a documented history of making false accusations against medical institutions." Judge Williams, a former federal prosecutor herself, silenced Kellerman with a look that could freeze helium. "Mr. Kellerman, your client will have ample opportunity to present her defense. For now, I want to hear the prosecution's evidence. Ms. Morrison, proceed." Morrison activated the courtroom's multimedia system and began with the recordings Eleanor had made during Victoria's phone conversation at the charity gala. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom with clinical detachment as she discussed organ harvest timelines and genetic enhancement procedures. "The timeline is accelerating, the organ compatibility is perfect, and Marcus is responding well to the preparation protocol. We can proceed with harvest next Tuesday." Eleanor, sitting in the witness gallery, watched Victoria's face as her own words condemned her. The doctor maintained her composed expression, but Eleanor caught the micro-expressions of calculation as Victoria tried to determine how much evidence the prosecution actually possessed. Morrison continued with the genetic analysis reports that proved Subject 7 had been created using DNA harvested from deceased children. The courtroom fell silent as she read the names of 12 children who had died under suspicious circumstances at hospitals where Victoria had served as consulting physician. David Martinez, age 4, died during routine appendectomy complications at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Genetic material harvested post-mortem without family consent. Morrison's voice carried the weight of each name like an accusation. Sarah Chen, age 7, died of sudden organ failure during tonsil surgery at Tucson Medical Center. Genetic material harvested and incorporated into Subject 7's enhanced cardiovascular system. Elena felt tears burning her eyes as Morrison read David's name. Her nephew's genetic legacy lived on in the hybrid infant that federal medical teams were still struggling to keep alive in a specialized research facility. The baby that Victoria had created as a source of organs had become the living proof of her crimes against children who could no longer speak for themselves. Defense attorney Kellerman attempted to interrupt. "Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. There is no evidence connecting my client to these unfortunate medical outcomes." "Mr. Kellerman," Judge Williams interrupted with dangerous quiet, "are you suggesting the genetic analysis is fabricated?" Morrison seized the opening. "Your Honor, if I may present Exhibit 47, the pharmaceutical purchase records recovered from Dr. Sterling's laboratory." The courtroom monitor displayed a spreadsheet documenting 3 years of illegal drug purchases, including controlled substances used to suppress immune systems and experimental compounds not approved for human use. Each entry was cross-referenced with dates corresponding to the children's deaths, creating a timeline that connected Victoria's laboratory activities to the systematic harvesting of genetic material from deceased minors. These pharmaceutical records show that Dr. Sterling was preparing for genetic modification procedures months before each child's death, Morrison explained to the court. "The timing is not coincidental. Dr. Sterling was targeting specific children for genetic harvesting based on their biological compatibility with her enhancement projects." Victoria's composure finally cracked, her face flushing with anger as she leaned toward Kellerman to whisper urgently in his ear. Elena recognized the expression from her weeks inside the Sterling estate, the look of someone whose carefully constructed control was beginning to unravel. Morrison presented the video evidence Elena had recorded in the basement laboratory, showing Subject 7 connected to life support systems, while genetic charts documented the planned organ harvest schedule. The hybrid infant's artificially enhanced biology was visible even to non-medical observers, proving that Victoria had pushed genetic modification far beyond the boundaries of legal research. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison addressed the court, "Subject 7 represents the culmination of Dr. Sterling's illegal genetic program. This infant was created using DNA stolen from 12 deceased children for the sole purpose of providing enhanced organs to wealthy clients willing to pay for genetic superiority." The courtroom erupted as reporters realized they were witnessing evidence of actual genetic enhancement procedures that had previously existed only in science fiction. Judge Williams called for order, but the damage was done. Victoria Sterling's crimes had just become the most significant genetic trafficking case in legal history. Morrison presented the customer communications intercepted from Victoria's encrypted phone records, revealing an international network of wealthy families seeking genetic enhancements for their children. The evidence showed that Marcus Sterling was merely one client in a global operation that had been providing illegal genetic modifications to the highest bidders. Dr. Sterling wasn't just conducting unauthorized research, Morrison explained. She was running a commercial genetic enhancement service, using DNA harvested from deceased children to create custom organ donors for wealthy families seeking to give their children superhuman capabilities. Elena watched Victoria's defense team scramble as Morrison systematically dismantled every lie they had prepared. The evidence was overwhelming, documented in Victoria's own research notes and recorded in her own voice during intercepted phone calls. There was no way to deny the genetic charts, the pharmaceutical records, or the existence of Subject 7 in the Sterling basement. Kellerman made one final attempt to salvage his client's position. "Your Honor, even if we accept the prosecution's characterization of Dr. Sterling's research, there is no evidence of criminal intent. My client believed she was conducting legitimate medical research to save children's lives." Morrison cut him off with the recording of Victoria's conversation about terminating Elena as a witness. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom once again, this time discussing the planned elimination of anyone who might expose her operation. "The nanny is just a former nurse with financial problems, easily controlled and easily disposed of when necessary." The casual discussion of murder destroyed any pretense that Victoria had been conducting legitimate research. Elena felt the courtroom's attention focus on her as people realized she had been marked for elimination simply for discovering the truth about Victoria's genetic crimes. Judge Williams called for a recess, but the outcome was already clear. Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed defense had collapsed under the weight of evidence that proved systematic genetic trafficking, human experimentation, and conspiracy to commit multiple homicides. During the break, Elena found herself surrounded by federal prosecutors who wanted to thank her for her courage in gathering evidence that had made this prosecution possible. But Elena's attention was focused on the monitor, displaying Subject 7's vital signs from the research facility, where federal medical teams were struggling to determine the hybrid infant's long-term survival prospects. "What happens to the baby now?" Elena asked Agent Chen, who had been coordinating with federal medical specialists about Subject 7's care. "That's going to be decided by bioethics committees and federal courts," Chen replied. "But I can tell you that baby is alive today because you refused to let Victoria Sterling complete her harvest schedule. Whatever happens next, Subject 7 has a chance at life because you gave it one." When court reconvened, Victoria Sterling's composure had completely shattered. She sat at the defense table with the hollow expression of someone who had just watched their empire collapse in real time. The evidence was insurmountable, the prosecution airtight, and her legal team out of options. Judge Williams addressed the court with the gravity appropriate to a case that would reshape genetic crime prosecution for generations. "Based on the evidence presented, I am ordering Dr. Victoria Sterling held without bail, pending trial on federal charges of human trafficking, illegal genetic experimentation, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of international bioethics treaties." As federal marshals approached to take Victoria into custody, she finally looked directly at Elena for the first time since the proceedings began. The look that passed between them was electric with mutual recognition. The moment when both women understood that justice had prevailed over the arrogance of someone who had believed herself above the law. Elena watched Victoria Sterling disappear through the courthouse doors in federal custody, knowing that the woman who had stolen her nephew's genetic legacy would spend the rest of her life paying for her crimes against children who had died too young and too far from justice. The evidence drop was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Subject 7's future remained uncertain, and Elena still had to rebuild her own life in the aftermath of bringing down a genetic trafficking empire. But for now, it was enough that the truth had finally been heard. Federal Detention Center Phoenix had housed its share of high-profile criminals, but Dr. Victoria Sterling's arrival marked the first time the facility had processed a defendant whose crimes required consultation with international bioethics experts. The woman who had once commanded a genetic empire worth hundreds of millions now shuffled through intake procedures in orange detention clothing, her hands shackled with the same restraints used for violent offenders. Elena watched the perp walk from the courthouse steps, surrounded by media crews, documenting every moment of Victoria's transition from respected physician to federal prisoner. The arrogance that had once made Victoria believe herself untouchable had evaporated, replaced by the hollow expression of someone confronting the mathematical certainty of life imprisonment. The sentencing hearing 3 months later drew an even larger crowd than the preliminary proceedings. Subject 7 had survived transfer to the CDC's specialized containment facility in Atlanta, where teams of geneticists studied the hybrid infant's artificially enhanced biology, while ethicists debated its legal status. Marcus Sterling had made a complete recovery after being weaned off the immunosuppressive drugs, and was now living with his paternal grandparents under federal protective custody. Judge Williams called the court to order as Victoria Sterling stood to receive the verdict that would define the remainder of her natural life. The woman who had once dissected genetic codes with surgical precision now faced the systematic dismantling of her freedom, one charge at a time. Dr. Victoria Sterling, Judge Williams began, with the formal gravity reserved for the most serious federal crimes. You have been found guilty on all counts, 12 counts of human trafficking resulting in death, conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, illegal genetic experimentation on human subjects, violation of international bioethics treaties, federal fraud exceeding $50 million, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances without license. Eleanor sat in the gallery next to Miguel Santos, whose investigative reporting had helped expose the international scope of Victoria's genetic trafficking network. The evidence they had gathered together had led to arrests in 7 countries and the shutdown of genetic enhancement operations that had victimized dozens of children across 3 continents. The court has reviewed victim impact statements from families of the 12 children whose genetic material was stolen for your illegal enhancement program, Judge Williams continued. I have also considered testimony from federal medical experts regarding the unprecedented nature of your crimes against children who died trusting medical professionals to heal rather than harvest them. Victoria's defense team had exhausted every legal strategy available, from claiming mental defect to arguing that her research represented legitimate medical advancement. Nothing had withstood the mountain of evidence Elena had documented during her weeks inside the Sterling compound. Victoria's own research notes, recorded conversations, and the existence of Subject 7 provided proof of systematic genetic crimes that no legal technicality could overcome. The sentence of this court is life imprisonment without possibility of parole on each count of human trafficking resulting in death, Judge Williams pronounced with finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. These sentences will run consecutively, not concurrently, ensuring that you will never again have the opportunity to harm children in pursuit of your genetic enhancement fantasies. Elena felt a weight lift from her chest as she heard the words that ensured Victoria Sterling would spend the remainder of her life in federal prison. Justice for David and the 11 other children whose genetic legacy had been stolen would never bring them back, but it would prevent Victoria from creating new victims. The bailiff moved to escort Victoria from the courtroom, but she turned to address Judge Williams one final time with the desperate arrogance of someone unwilling to accept defeat. Your Honor, my research could have eliminated genetic disease forever. These children's deaths were tragic accidents, but my work could have saved thousands of future lives. Dr. Sterling, Judge Williams interrupted with ice-cold authority, you systematically murdered 12 children to harvest their genetic material for illegal enhancement procedures. You created a hybrid infant designed for organ harvesting. You planned to kill witnesses to protect your criminal enterprise. Your delusions about saving lives do not mitigate the reality that you are a serial killer who used medical training to prey upon the most vulnerable members of society. Victoria's final plea died in her throat as federal marshals led her away in chains. Her medical degrees and professional reputation reduced to evidence in the criminal case that had exposed her true nature. Elena watched the woman who had threatened her daughter disappear through the courthouse doors, knowing that Victoria Sterling's genetic trafficking empire had been permanently dismantled. After the sentencing, Elena met with federal prosecutors who briefed her on the continuing investigation into Victoria's international network. The Sterling biotech facilities in Switzerland and Singapore had been raided simultaneously, revealing additional evidence of genetic trafficking operations that had been providing enhancement services to wealthy families willing to pay millions for superhuman children. Your investigation didn't just bring down Victoria Sterling, US. Attorney Morrison told Elena during the debriefing. You exposed an entire industry built on genetic trafficking and child exploitation. The evidence you gathered has led to prosecutions in 12 countries and the rescue of at least 6 children who were being prepared for illegal enhancement procedures. Elena nodded, but her thoughts were focused on Subject 7, who remained in federal custody while bioethics committees debated the legal status of artificially created hybrid beings. The infant that Victoria had designed as an organ donor had become a living symbol of both genetic crime and the resilience of life itself. What's going to happen to Subject 7? Elena asked the question that had haunted her since discovering the hybrid infant in Victoria's basement laboratory. Morrison exchanged glances with Agent Chen before responding. That's still being decided at the highest levels of government. Subject 7 represents unprecedented legal territory, a genetically modified being created through criminal acts, but possessing apparent consciousness and the capacity for development. The bioethics committees are divided between treating the infant as evidence of crimes or recognizing it as a being with inherent rights. Elena felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that had driven her to expose Victoria's crimes in the first place. Subject 7 carried David's genetic legacy, making the hybrid infant family in ways that transcended legal definitions. I want to be considered as a potential guardian if that becomes possible. We'll make sure your request is included in the federal review, Chen assured her. But you should know that Subject 7's medical requirements are extraordinary. The genetic modifications require ongoing specialized care that most facilities can't provide. Elena had considered this reality during the months since Victoria's arrest. Subject 7's artificial enhancements meant the infant would never have a normal life, but Elena's nursing background had taught her that normal was less important than loved. If the federal government decided that hybrid beings possessed rights, Elena wanted to ensure that Subject 7 had someone willing to fight for those rights. 3 weeks after Victoria's sentencing, Elena received a call from the federal facility in Atlanta where Subject 7 was being maintained. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had led the medical team during the Sterling compound raid, delivered news that changed everything. Elena, we've made a breakthrough in Subject 7's care. The hybrid biology is more stable than we initially believed, and the infant is showing normal cognitive development patterns despite the genetic modifications. More importantly, we've identified a way to gradually reduce the life support requirements. Elena felt hope flare in her chest for the first time since discovering Subject 7 in Victoria's laboratory. Are you saying the baby could survive outside a controlled medical environment? Not immediately, but potentially within 6 months with proper transitional care. The question is whether anyone would be willing to provide the specialized care required for a genetically modified infant with unknown long-term development patterns. Elena didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever is necessary. 6 months later, Elena stood in the specialized nursery at Phoenix Children's Hospital, watching Subject 7, who she had named David in honor of her nephew, take his first breaths without mechanical assistance. The hybrid infant's genetic modifications had stabilized into a sustainable biological pattern that no longer required constant medical intervention. The federal government had ultimately decided that genetically modified beings possessed inherent rights regardless of their origins, setting legal precedent that would shape bioethics debates for generations. Elena had been approved as David's guardian after extensive psychological evaluation and specialized training in managing his unique medical requirements. Dr. Victoria Sterling remained in federal prison, serving consecutive life sentences that ensured she would never again harm children in pursuit of genetic enhancement fantasies. Her genetic trafficking network had been dismantled, her research destroyed, and her reputation reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of medical arrogance unchecked by ethical constraints. Elena carried David home to the apartment in South Phoenix, where Sophia waited to meet her new baby brother. The hybrid infant, who had been created as an organ donor, had become something far more powerful, living proof that even the most monstrous crimes could be overcome by the simple human capacity to choose love over fear. As Elena settled David into the crib that Miguel had helped her assemble, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had entered Victoria Sterling's employment as a desperate single mother facing eviction. She was leaving as the guardian of a child whose very existence represented triumph over those who believed that wealth and education placed them above the law. The fall of Victoria Sterling was complete, but David's life was just beginning. And Elena had learned that sometimes the most profound victories came not from destroying enemies, but from saving the innocent caught in their wake. Justice had been served, but more importantly, love had prevailed. The Sterling Biotech headquarters in downtown Phoenix looked like a glass monument to medical progress, but by dawn on Tuesday morning, it had been transformed into the epicenter of the largest corporate crime investigation in Arizona history. Federal agents streamed through the building's 37 floors, methodically documenting evidence of a genetic trafficking operation that had operated for 3 years under the veneer of legitimate medical research. Elena stood in the lobby with Agent Chen, watching evidence technicians dismantle the corporate empire that Victoria Sterling had built on the stolen genetics of dead children. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had once hired her to care for a supposedly sick child was now facing corporate dissolution proceedings that would liquidate every asset to compensate victims' families. The forensic accounting team estimates Sterling Biotech's total assets at approximately $400 million. Chen briefed Elena as they watched corporate executives being escorted from the building in federal custody. That includes real estate, equipment, research patents, and offshore accounts in 12 countries. All of it will be seized under federal forfeiture laws. The cleanup of Victoria Sterling's genetic empire required coordination between federal agencies that had never before dealt with crimes involving artificially created human beings. The Department of Justice had established a special task force to handle the unprecedented legal questions raised by Subject 7's existence, while international law enforcement agencies worked to identify and rescue additional victims of genetic trafficking operations. Elena followed Chen to the 35th floor, where Sterling Biotech's research laboratories had been sealed as federal crime scenes. The equipment Victoria had used to create Subject 7 sat under evidence tags worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Genetic sequences, cell cultivation chambers, and surgical suites that had been disguised as legitimate medical research facilities. We've identified at least 6 other facilities connected to Sterling's operation, Chen explained, as they walked through laboratories that felt more like crime scenes than medical facilities. 2 in Switzerland, 1 in Singapore, 1 in South Korea, 1 in Brazil, and 1 in Mexico. International law enforcement is conducting simultaneous raids to prevent destruction of evidence. The scope of Victoria Sterling's crimes had expanded with each piece of evidence uncovered during the corporate investigation. The genetic enhancement services had been marketed to wealthy families across 3 continents, promising superhuman capabilities for children whose parents could afford to bypass natural genetics. The customer list read like a directory of international wealth: tech billionaires, pharmaceutical executives, politicians, and royalty who had paid millions for genetic modifications that violated every bioethics treaty in existence. The customer communications show that Sterling was planning to expand into cognitive enhancement, Chen continued, displaying intercepted emails on her tablet. The next phase would have involved neurological modifications designed to increase intelligence, memory capacity, and emotional regulation. She was essentially planning to create a genetic aristocracy for the highest bidders. Elena studied the emails with the horrified fascination of someone who had narrowly escaped becoming a victim herself. Victoria's plans for Marcus hadn't been limited to physical enhancement. The organ transplant schedule included neurological tissue designed to give him cognitive capabilities 30% above baseline human intelligence. The boy who was supposed to be dying from genetic disease was actually being prepared to become a genetically superior human being. The legal proceedings had moved with unprecedented speed once federal prosecutors realized the international scope of Victoria's operations. The Sterling Biotech Board of Directors faced federal conspiracy charges. Pharmaceutical suppliers were being investigated for providing controlled substances without proper authorization, and hospital administrators who had facilitated genetic harvesting were facing criminal prosecution in multiple jurisdictions. Dr. James Sterling has agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentencing, Chen informed Elena as they reached Victoria's executive office, which had been stripped of everything except evidence tags marking where documents had been seized. He claims he was unaware of the genetic harvesting operation, but his research notes suggest otherwise. Elena wasn't surprised that Victoria's husband was attempting to distance himself from crimes that would result in life imprisonment. But the evidence suggested that Dr. James Sterling had been instrumental in developing the genetic modification techniques that made Subject 7 possible. His cooperation would help prosecutors identify additional victims, but it wouldn't save him from significant prison time. The victim impact statements had become the most emotionally challenging aspect of the legal proceedings. Families of the 12 children whose genetic material had been harvested for Victoria's enhancement program testified about their loss, while prosecutors documented how their children's deaths had been exploited for criminal profit. Elena's statement about discovering David's genetic markers in Subject 7 had been particularly powerful evidence of how personal Victoria's crimes had become. The Federal Victims' Compensation Fund has been established at $50 million, Chen explained as they reviewed the financial documentation. That includes direct payments to victims' families, funding for Subject 7's ongoing medical care, and resources for any additional hybrid beings we might discover in international facilities. The question of what to do with artificially created hybrid beings had required emergency bioethics consultations at the highest levels of government. Subject 7's obvious consciousness and capacity for development had forced federal authorities to recognize genetically modified beings as possessing inherent rights, regardless of their criminal origins. The precedent would reshape bioethics law for decades, establishing legal protections for artificial beings while criminalizing the genetic trafficking that created them. Elena received updates on Subject 7's progress through daily medical reports that documented the hybrid infant's remarkable adaptation to life outside controlled laboratory conditions. David's genetic modifications had stabilized into sustainable biology that no longer required constant medical intervention, though his enhanced physiology would require specialized monitoring throughout his development. The CDC's preliminary assessment suggests that David's genetic modifications will result in enhanced immune function, increased cardiovascular capacity, and accelerated neurological development. Dr. Amanda Foster had briefed Elena during her weekly Guardian consultation. But we're in uncharted territory regarding long-term effects. David is essentially the first of his kind. Elena had accepted the responsibility of raising a genetically modified child whose capabilities and limitations remained unknown. But her nursing experience had taught her that children needed love and stability more than they needed normal genetics. David would face unique challenges as he grew, but he would face them with the security of knowing someone was willing to fight for his right to exist. The cleanup of Sterling Biotech's international operations had revealed the global scope of genetic trafficking that existed beneath the surface of legitimate medical research. The wealthy families who had purchased enhancement services for their children faced prosecution for child endangerment and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Several international politicians had resigned in disgrace after their connections to genetic trafficking operations became public. The Swiss facility had been operating for 5 years, Chen reported, as she showed Elena surveillance footage from the Zurich raids. We recovered evidence of at least 20 genetic modification procedures performed on children of wealthy European families. The enhanced children are being provided with medical evaluation to determine the extent of illegal modifications. Elena felt sick thinking about children who'd been subjected to experimental genetic procedures by parents seeking superhuman offspring. The psychological impact of discovering that one's enhanced capabilities came from the harvested genetics of dead children would require specialized therapy for victims who were simultaneously perpetrators of genetic trafficking crimes. 3 months after Victoria Sterling's sentencing, Elena attended the federal hearing that would determine the final disposition of Sterling Biotech's remaining assets. The corporate liquidation had generated enough funds to provide substantial compensation to victims' families while funding long-term medical care for hybrid beings discovered in international facilities. Judge Williams presided over the asset forfeiture hearing with the same gravity she had brought to Victoria's criminal trial. The court finds that Sterling Biotech's corporate assets were obtained through systematic criminal activity involving the exploitation of deceased children for genetic trafficking purposes. Therefore, all assets will be forfeited to the federal government for victim compensation and prevention of future genetic trafficking crimes. Eleanor watched the final dissolution of Victoria Sterling's empire with the satisfaction of someone who had personally dismantled a criminal operation through patient investigation and moral courage. The woman who had threatened to kill her to protect genetic trafficking secrets was now serving consecutive life sentences, while her corporate legacy was reduced to compensation for the families she had victimized. The cleanup phase was nearly complete, but Elena knew that the real work was just beginning. David was thriving in her care, showing the enhanced cognitive development that Dr. Foster had predicted, while displaying the emotional needs of any infant who required love and stability. Sophia had embraced her role as protective older sister to a baby brother whose genetic modifications made him unique in human history. As Elena left the courthouse after the final asset forfeiture hearing, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a desperate single mother into the guardian of a hybrid child whose existence represented both the depths of human criminality and the triumph of justice over genetic trafficking. Victoria Sterling had believed that wealth and education placed her above the law, but she had underestimated the determination of an ordinary woman willing to risk everything to protect children, all children, including those created in laboratories and marked for harvesting. The cleanup was complete, but David's story was just beginning. And Elena had learned that sometimes the most profound victories came not from destroying enemies, but from creating families strong enough to love the innocent survivors of their crimes. Justice had been served, assets had been forfeited, and the Sterling Empire had been permanently dismantled. But the hybrid child, sleeping peacefully in Elena's arms, represented something more powerful than any legal victory. Proof that even the most monstrous crimes could be overcome by the simple human capacity to choose love over fear. The fall was complete. The cleanup was finished, and life, enhanced or natural, continued to find a way forward. 5 years after Elena Vasquez first entered the Sterling estate as a desperate nanny seeking salvation, she stood in the same Phoenix courthouse where Victoria Sterling's empire had crumbled, but this time as a witness in the final chapter of genetic trafficking prosecutions that had spanned 3 continents and reshaped international bioethics law forever. Dr. Victoria Sterling, now a hollow-eyed woman whose intellectual arrogance had been ground down by 5 years of federal maximum security imprisonment, sat in shackles as Judge Williams prepared to deliver the verdict in the civil damages trial that would determine final compensation for victims' families. The woman who had once commanded a genetic empire worth hundreds of millions was now worth exactly nothing, her medical degrees stripped, her research legacy reduced to cautionary tales taught in bioethics courses worldwide. Elena watched from the gallery as the final mathematical accounting of Victoria's crimes was read into the federal record. 12 children's lives stolen for genetic harvesting. 6 hybrid beings created for organ donation. Dozens of wealthy families who had purchased illegal genetic enhancements for their children. An international trafficking network that had operated for 7 years before Elena's investigation brought it crashing down. The court awards compensatory damages in the amount of $200 million to victims' families. Judge Williams announced, with the finality of someone who had spent 5 years ensuring that every aspect of Victoria Sterling's crimes faced legal consequences. The defendants' remaining assets, including intellectual property rights and international holdings, will be liquidated to satisfy these judgments. Elena felt a profound sense of closure as she heard the final financial destruction of Victoria Sterling's legacy. The money couldn't bring back the children whose genetic material had been stolen, but it would provide security for their families and fund the specialized medical research needed to care for the hybrid beings who had survived Victoria's enhancement experiments. David Vasquez Santos sat beside Elena in the gallery, his 5-year-old frame carrying the enhanced genetics that marked him as living proof of both human criminality and resilience. His cognitive development had exceeded every prediction made by federal medical experts, but his emotional needs remained those of any child who required love, stability, and protection from those who saw him as a scientific curiosity rather than a human being. "Mama, why is the angry doctor in chains?" David asked, with the enhanced linguistic capacity that made him sound older than his chronological age, while maintaining the emotional directness of childhood. Elena had struggled with how to explain Victoria Sterling's crimes to a child whose very existence resulted from those crimes. She hurt children to try to make other children different, mijo. The chains remind everyone that hurting children is never acceptable, no matter what someone thinks they're accomplishing. David nodded, with the serious consideration that characterized his enhanced cognitive processing. "She made me different, but you made me safe." Elena felt tears burn her eyes as she realized how completely David had integrated his artificial origins into a stable sense of identity. He understood that his genetics were unusual, but he had learned that family was defined by love rather than biology. The hybrid infant who had been created as an organ donor had become a beloved son whose enhanced capabilities were balanced by the emotional security of knowing he was wanted exactly as he was. Sophia, now 13 and fiercely protective of her genetically modified little brother, leaned over to whisper to David, "The chains also mean she can never hurt any more children. That's what justice looks like, making sure bad people can't keep being bad." The legal proceedings had established precedents that would govern genetic crime prosecution for generations. The international treaties recognizing the rights of artificially created beings had emerged directly from the evidence Elena gathered in Victoria's basement laboratory. David's existence had forced the global legal community to acknowledge that consciousness and capacity for development, rather than natural origins, determined personhood under law. Miguel Santos, whose investigative reporting had helped expose the international scope of genetic trafficking, approached Elena during the court recess. His articles documenting the Sterling case had won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism, but he took greater satisfaction in knowing that his partnership with Elena had prevented future victims. The final count is 23 hybrid beings recovered from international facilities, Miguel reported as they stood in the courthouse corridor watching federal marshals prepare to transport Victoria Sterling back to federal prison. All of them are now in specialized care facilities or with approved guardian families. The legal precedents established by David's case have ensured they'll be recognized as full persons under international law. Elena nodded, thinking about the other families who were learning to love children created through criminal genetics. The hybrid beings discovered in Sterling Biotech's international facilities had required extensive medical evaluation and psychological support, but most had adapted successfully to life outside laboratory conditions. David's case had provided the legal framework and medical protocols that made their integration into human families possible. "What's Victoria's actual sentence breakdown?" Elena asked, realizing she had lost track of the cumulative legal consequences during 5 years of appeals and international prosecutions. Miguel consulted his notes from covering every aspect of the Sterling trials. 12 consecutive life sentences for the genetic trafficking murders, plus additional federal time for conspiracy, fraud, and international bioethics violations. Even with theoretical good behavior, she's looking at a minimum of 300 years in federal maximum security. She'll die in prison, and her death won't reduce her sentence. Eleanor felt a cold satisfaction hearing the mathematical certainty of Victoria Sterling's permanent incarceration. The woman who had planned to kill Elena to protect her genetic trafficking secrets would never again have the opportunity to harm children in pursuit of enhancement fantasies. Judge Williams reconvened court to deliver her final statement in the Sterling case, addressing not just the immediate legal participants, but the international community that had watched genetic crime prosecution establish new precedents for bioethics enforcement. Dr. Victoria Sterling's crimes represent the most significant genetic trafficking case in human history. Judge Williams began with the gravity appropriate to landmark legal proceedings. Her systematic exploitation of deceased children for illegal enhancement procedures has forever changed how the international legal community approaches genetic crime and artificial being rights. Eleanor listened as Judge Williams summarized 5 years of legal proceedings that had reshaped bioethics law, international trafficking treaties, and the fundamental definition of personhood in an age of genetic modification. The Sterling case had established that artificially created beings possessed inherent rights, that genetic trafficking constituted crimes against humanity, and that medical degrees provided no immunity from prosecution for systematic child exploitation. The defendant will spend the remainder of her natural life in federal prison, Judge Williams concluded, ensuring that she will never again have the opportunity to harm children in pursuit of genetic enhancement experiments. Her crimes have been documented in detail to serve as a permanent warning about the consequences of medical arrogance unchecked by ethical constraints. As federal marshals led Victoria Sterling away for the final time, she turned to look directly at Elena with the hollow expression of someone who had finally understood that intellectual superiority provided no protection against the consequences of criminal choices. The look that passed between them was electric, with mutual recognition, the moment when both women acknowledged that justice had ultimately prevailed over the arrogance of someone who had believed herself above the law. Elena left the courthouse carrying David in her arms, surrounded by the extended family that had formed around their unique circumstances. Sophia walked beside them with the protective confidence of a teenager who had learned that family meant defending those you loved, regardless of their genetic origins. Miguel documented their departure for the final article in his Sterling series, capturing the image of a hybrid child who had overcome criminal origins to find security in the love of someone willing to fight for his right to exist. 3 months later, Elena received notification that she had been selected as the keynote speaker for the International Conference on Genetic Ethics and Artificial Being Rights. Her testimony about discovering Subject 7 and documenting Victoria Sterling's crimes had become required reading in bioethics programs worldwide, but Eleanor had declined most speaking opportunities, preferring to focus on raising David and Sophia rather than becoming a public symbol of genetic crime resistance. She did accept one invitation to speak at Phoenix Children's Hospital's annual conference on pediatric ethics, the same institution where her nephew David had died under suspicious circumstances that had eventually led to Victoria Sterling's genetic trafficking operation. 5 years ago, I was a desperate single mother who took a nanny job to avoid eviction, Elena told an audience of medical professionals who had gathered to hear her story. I thought I was accepting employment to care for a sick child. Instead, I discovered a genetic trafficking operation that had been harvesting DNA from deceased children to create custom organ donors for wealthy clients. Elena looked out at the audience of doctors, nurses, and medical administrators who had the power to prevent future genetic trafficking crimes through vigilant oversight and ethical courage. Victoria Sterling believed that intellectual superiority gave her the right to play God with children's lives. She was wrong. No degree, no research goal, and no amount of money justifies exploiting children for genetic experimentation. After her speech, Elena drove home to the modest house in Phoenix that had become a sanctuary for her unconventional family. David played in the backyard with enhanced physical capabilities that made him faster and stronger than other 5-year-olds, but his favorite activity remained reading stories with Sophia, who had appointed herself his primary tutor in navigating a world that often stared at his unusual genetics. "Mama, will I always be different from other kids?" David asked during their evening routine, his enhanced cognitive development allowing him to process concepts that would challenge much older children. Elena considered how to answer a question that touched on genetics, ethics, and the fundamental nature of identity. "You'll always be genetically unique, mijo, but different doesn't mean less valuable. Your genetics make you special, but your character makes you important." David nodded with the serious consideration that characterized his enhanced cognitive processing. Sophia says, "Being different is only a problem if you're different in mean ways. I don't want to be different in mean ways." Elena felt her heart swell with pride for both her children, Sophia for developing the emotional wisdom to guide her genetically modified brother, and David for inheriting enough humanity to care about moral character despite his artificial origins. As Elena tucked David into bed, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a desperate woman facing eviction into the guardian of a hybrid child whose existence represented triumph over those who believed wealth and education placed them above the law. The investigation that had begun with her nephew's suspicious death had evolved into a global campaign against genetic trafficking that had saved dozens of children and established legal precedents protecting artificially created beings. Victoria Sterling remained in federal maximum security prison, serving consecutive life sentences that ensured she would never again harm children in pursuit of genetic enhancement fantasies. Her criminal empire had been dismantled, her assets liquidated for victim compensation, and her research legacy reduced to cautionary tales about medical arrogance unchecked by ethical constraints. But the real victory wasn't Victoria's destruction. It was David's survival and integration into a family that loved him exactly as he was, enhanced genetics and all. The hybrid infant who had been created as an organ donor had become a beloved son, whose existence proved that even the most monstrous crimes could be overcome by the simple human capacity to choose love over fear. Elena turned off David's bedroom light and walked to the kitchen, where Sophia was finishing homework that challenged her intellectually, while David's presence challenged her emotionally to become the protective older sister that every vulnerable child deserved. "How was the speech today?" Sophia asked, looking up from calculus problems that would have impressed college students. "I told them the truth," Elena replied. "Sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things to protect children from those who see them as experiments rather than human beings." Sophia nodded with the serious understanding of someone who had learned that family meant fighting for those you loved, regardless of their genetic origins or artificial creation. "David's lucky you found him before the angry doctor could hurt him." Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes as she realized how completely her family had integrated David's unusual origins into their understanding of what it meant to love unconditionally. The hybrid child who carried her nephew's genetic legacy had become the bridge between loss and healing, proving that justice could create families even stronger than those destroyed by crime. Outside, the Arizona desert stretched toward horizons that held infinite possibility for a genetically modified child whose enhanced capabilities were balanced by the emotional security of knowing he was wanted exactly as he was. David's future remained uncertain in ways that no parent could predict, but Elena had learned that uncertainty was less important than unconditional love. Victoria Sterling had believed that genetic superiority could be purchased through criminal enhancement procedures, but she had underestimated the power of families willing to love children regardless of their origins. The woman who had tried to play God with human genetics had been permanently defeated by the simple truth that children needed love more than they needed perfect DNA. Fuck around and find out. Victoria Sterling had fucked around with genetic trafficking, child exploitation, and the systematic harvesting of DNA from deceased children. And she had found out that some crimes carried consequences that lasted multiple lifetimes, enforced by a legal system that protected the innocent and punished those who preyed upon them. But more importantly, she had found out that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capacity for moral courage when children's lives hung in the balance. Elena Vasquez had entered Victoria's employment as a desperate woman seeking survival and had emerged as the guardian of a hybrid child whose existence represented triumph over those who believed wealth and education placed them above the law. Justice had been served, precedents had been established, and genetic trafficking had been permanently criminalized under international law. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. A genetically modified child sleeping peacefully in a home where he was loved unconditionally, protected absolutely, and valued exactly as he was. Elena walked to the window overlooking the backyard, where David would play tomorrow with enhanced capabilities, balanced by the emotional security of knowing someone was willing to fight for his right to exist. The hybrid infant who had been created as an organ donor had become living proof that even the most monstrous crimes could be overcome by the simple human capacity to choose love over fear. The verdict was final, the cleanup complete, and the Sterling Empire permanently destroyed. But David's story was just beginning, and Elena had learned that sometimes the most profound victories came not from destroying enemies, but from saving the innocent caught in their wake and proving that family was defined by love rather than genetics. In the end, that was justice enough.